Everybody, welcome to week 6. These are the things you got to know. When working with athletes, they are able to bolster our manufacturer ad campaigns through their talent and through their brand recognition, so to speak. Athletes are important to the brands simply because they convey a sort of a personal feel to the brand and also build an allegiance to it, because fans of that athlete will be true to that athlete and stay to the products that they represent and feel are worth promoting. When we think about indirect sources for promotion, that's something that's coming from an outside source. So that's something that's not paid for by the manufacturer or is not derived directly from the manufacturer. This could be something like an article written on a blog where somebody reviewed a product even though they had no inner workings with the brand or didn't cooperate with the brand in any way. This would be a way of creating a buzz around a product that had an indirect consequence or an indirect promotion to it. At different points, a brand may experience difficulties either due through manufacturer defects or warranty issues, or perhaps their new line isn't quite up to snuff compared to the competitors. And oftentimes brands will bring in athletes or ad agencies to create counter arguments to this and to help bolster the public's image of that brand within that particular industry. And this helps offset those counter arguments that are going to come as a result of the negative press or the bad connotation that's associated with those products. One of the most important parts of promotional activities in the modern world is having expertise or having that knowledge of product, so that as you're talking to an end consumer or as you're talking to the general public, that promotional rep knows what they're talking about and they're an expert in their field. One of the interesting things about marketing is that you can have what's called a sleeper effect, where something is out in the world, whether it's through social media or through advertising or it's through different types of promotional pieces that have been created outside of the manufacturer's scope, that have this sleepover effect, which basically says that a low credibility source can gain awareness and can gain credibility over time just by the fact that it's out there. So if I say something about a product and people start to catch on and that word spreads, that will be a sleepover effect because it's starting to grow and it wasn't really a credible source that created it, but the fact that it's being shared makes a credibility factor start to happen, and also start to create a pathway for that to become more of a credible source, so to speak. When we think about what kind of athlete we want to have working for us as a brand, it's important that the brand and the athlete meet on certain aspects of what does the overarching goals of the partnership look like, and does that athlete overshadow the brand? It needs to be an equal partnership so that the brand is promoting the athlete and the athlete's promoting the brand. But there have been times where the athlete is just so big that the brand is sort of lost and nobody really seems to care. And that's sort of a waste then for that manufacturer, because they're not really getting what they bargained for. They're not really getting the return on it. Conversely, an athlete that tries to represent too many brands can lose their credibility or their trustworthiness, because as you've seen with athletes that are covered head to toe in different manufacturers, the messaging gets lost, right? There's too many logos that are happening there. And from a consumer standpoint, it's too confusing to think about all the different brands that this athlete tries to represent. So you'll see that most athletes try to focus on a clothing brand, a hard goods brand, and just try to keep it that way. And if at all possible, it's advantageous for like a Burton or a Solomon that can cover an athlete head to toe, because then it's just one brand that they're representing. As a way to fight back, brands will often limit how much an athlete can represent other brands. This is a way for brands to get the best return on that investment in that athlete. This also works on the athlete's behalf as well, because if their credibility is spread too thin over too many brands, then they start to lose their value of their athlete brand. So it's a win-win situation in that regard. In the modern era of social media, it's important to keep in mind the idea of meaning transfer, which basically says if there's been an issue or if there is an entanglement with myself, the manufacturer, and maybe my athlete that has been public and it's gone ugly, that whole process of airing it out through social media has created negative exposure, and I may want to disassociate myself with that athlete because I no longer want to be associated with that athlete. You've seen this where athletes have gotten caught up in scandal, or perhaps their ability has diminished and they're no longer at the top of their game. And so the brand will drop that contract in order to try to disassociate themselves with that particular athlete. Athletes and different types of personalities are rated on a Q score, which basically says how valuable they are from a marketing standpoint. This is adjusted weekly, and different companies do these types of ratings to help manufacturers understand where a particular athlete stands within their industry and who's on the rise, who's on the decline, those kinds of things to help gauge how athletes are performing from a marketing standpoint. So when you create a message for an advertising or promotional campaign, you have the ability to create the verbiage however you want. When we talk about recency effect, that basically says that we're going to put the strongest message at the end, with the idea being that if I say the most important thing to you, the end consumer, at the last part of my messaging, you're more likely to retain that. Now, obviously, there's different pros and cons to this, but that's just one example of how to create verbiage that's going to work on your company's behalf. Historically speaking, in the snow sports world, when a consumer wanted to evaluate a product, they would typically have to go into a store, look at the product itself, maybe get a brochure, compare that to possibly like a magazine article or a magazine write-up on that particular product. But the internet has kind of supplanted all that, because most consumers can be pretty well informed by the time they actually enter a retail store, because they can do the research online, they can look at reviews, they can look at athlete placement, those kinds of things, and get a better sense of what the product is prior to actually walking into the store. Conversely, when we're thinking about pushing out a product that isn't really important, or the consumer isn't really interested in my particular product, I may want to put the strongest part of my message at the beginning of that particular ad. This allows me the ability to get that person's attention and hopefully get them to consider my product as an alternative to what they're currently using, or perhaps just to gain awareness of my product. Another way of attacking the promotional piece is to create what's called an open-ended message. This allows the consumer to draw their own conclusion on it, so we're not really making any bragging statements or anything that's very boisterous. We're just stating what we think our product is about and hoping that the consumer draws the conclusion that we are intending from that. But it's a little bit less persuasive as it is just more of a promotional, informative piece. Sometimes brands will create an open-ended message by creating what's called a two-sided message, where they'll talk about the pros of the product, so what's great about the product, how it works in certain areas, but also admit that maybe it doesn't work everywhere, right? And that is a bit more humble of an approach, but also gives the consumer a more real sense of the personality of that brand. And that brand gains some traction with the consumer because they're not saying this is the greatest thing for everybody everywhere. Historically, snow sports brands have used magazines and websites to promote their products to a large audience. This is the best way of getting your message out there, in terms of just more of a shotgun approach, where we're going to push out our marketing content and hope that it sticks. It's not always that effective, but if you're a new brand, or if you're trying to grow into a certain new territory, this can be effective just to get awareness about your product into the consumer's mind. So when you think about advertising, if you compare a paid advertisement to, say, a web article or a magazine article, there is inherent value to the article itself because it's coming from a third party. So if I write a positive piece about your brand, that's going to have a positive influence on your product's position in the marketplace, because I am a trusted source as a third party and it's not coming directly from the manufacturer. In the web world, we talk about organic searches, which are important because they arrive based on the merit of their content rather than being a paid advertisement. So if you do, say, like a Google or a Bing search or something like that, oftentimes the first few that come up will be a paid ad, and it'll actually say ad next to it. And then those first, say, 5, 10 websites that come up are a mix of keywords and organic results, because Google is trying to position the most relevant content to your inquiry as possible, through the internet search. One of the most important things to keep in mind when you're creating promotional content is to make sure that it's specific. So as we think about what we want to say and how we want to say it, it should be specific and relevant to the end consumer, because that's going to have the best effect in grabbing their attention and retaining that attention span so that we can convey our whole and complete message. When you look at the snow sports industry, we often use demos, on-snow demos, to stimulate trial, which is essentially a sampling or a product testing, so to speak, that allows the end consumer or even the retailer to get a better sense of the product. And this inherently helps us grow the brand and also get important feedback from the end consumer about our product in the marketplace.